Hey everyone, welcome back to Plainclothes Faith. I'm Nick, and I'm really glad you're here. Over the last few episodes, we've been talking about grace, what it means to receive it, what it looks like to live from it, and what happens when grace begins to shape how we treat people. But eventually, grace starts affecting something even bigger: community, relationships, the environments that we create around each other. Because whether we realize it or not, most people carry performance based thinking into relationships too, not just spiritually, socially, or emotionally. We learned very early in life how to present ourselves, how to manage perception, how to hide weaknesses, how to earn acceptance. And over time, that creates a certain kind of community, one where people feel pressure to appear okay, pressure to perform, pressure to maintain an image. And honestly, that can become exhausting because deep down, most people want something more than that. They want relationships where honesty is safe, where weakness doesn't immediately become rejection, where people don't have to constantly prove their worth, their value, or their belonging. And that's part of what makes grace so powerful because grace doesn't just change how we relate to God, it changes the kind of relationships that we begin to build around and with each other. Relationships shaped less by performance and more by honesty, patience, truth, and compassion. And that kind of community is becoming increasingly rare. Scripture gives us a picture of this kind of grace shaped community in the early church in Acts chapter 2. And what's interesting is that the picture we're given is not centered around performance, it's centered around presence. People sharing life together, being together, praying together, and supporting each other. And we see this in Acts 2, verses 44 through 47. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. What stands out there is not perfection, it's openness, generosity, shared burdens, a willingness to live honestly together. And honestly, that kind of community is difficult to build because human nature naturally moves us towards self protection, towards image management, towards hiding weaknesses, especially in environments where acceptance feels conditional. And a lot of people have experienced that. Communities where struggle feels unsafe, where questions feel unwelcome, where people felt pressure to appear spiritually strong all the time. And over time, that kind of environment can create distance, not closeness, because relationships cannot become deep when everyone feels like they have to perform. And that's part of why grace matters so much in community, because grace creates room for honesty, room for growth, room for people to still be in process. And that doesn't mean truth disappears or standards disappear. The early church still taught truth clearly, still called people towards transformation, but the foundation was different. People were not trying to earn belonging, they belonged. And that belonging became the place where growth happened. And that changes things because when people feel safe to be honest, relationships become real, not polished, not performative, real. And that kind of honesty is rare, especially today, because modern culture often rewards presentation more than authenticity. We learn how to curate ourselves, how to filter ourselves, how to show people the version of us that feels most acceptable. And after a while, it becomes difficult to know where performance ends and honesty begins. But a grace centered community moves in the opposite direction, not towards pretending, but towards truth, not towards image management, but towards genuine connection. And that kind of environment can be deeply healing because for many people, the experience of being fully known and still accepted is incredibly rare. And if we're honest, this is where many people struggle most, not necessarily with relationships, but with vulnerability. because being truly known can feel risky, especially if you've experienced rejection before, judgment before, or disappointment before. And over time, those experiences start shaping how you relate to people. You learn to be careful, careful with what you share, careful with weakness, careful with honesty, because somewhere along the way, you begin to believe that acceptance depends on presentation, on staying composed, on appearing okay. And honestly, that's a very human response to have because deep down, most people want belonging. They want connection. They want to know that they are accepted, valued, wanted. But many people also carry a fear that if others really saw everything, the doubts, the struggles, the imperfections, and acceptance might disappear. And that fear can quietly shape relationships. It can keep conversations shallow. It can keep people emotionally distant. It can make communities feel present externally, but lonely internally. Because it's difficult to feel deeply connected when you feel like you're constantly managing how you're perceived. And that's one reason that grace centered relationships matter so much. Because grace creates space for honesty, not forced vulnerability, not oversharing everything, but environments where people do not feel that they must constantly pretend. And that kind of environment can be incredibly healing because many people have spent years feeling like they had to earn belonging, earn approval, or earn their acceptance. But grace changes that dynamic. And one person who wrote deeply about this was Henri Nouwen. Nouwen spent much of his life reflecting on loneliness, belonging, and the human desire to be fully known and loved. And he once wrote, "What makes the temptation of rejection so painful is that it touches the deepest core of our existence." End quote. And that insight matters because it explains why vulnerability feels so difficult, why performance feels safer, why people hide. Because rejection cuts deeply. And yet, grace centered community moves us in a different direction. It says, you do not have to pretend to belong here. You do not have to perform to be valued. You do not have to hide weakness to remain accepted. And honestly, that kind of community doesn't happen automatically. It takes intentionality, patience, humility, and people willing to create environments where honesty is met with compassion instead of shame. And when that begins to happen, something powerful changes. People start breathing easier. Walls begin to come down. Conversations become more real. And relationships move beyond surface level connection into something deeper, something steadier, something shaped not by performance, but by grace. And maybe that's why grace centered community feels so different when you experience it, because it creates something that performance based environments rarely can: rest, not perfection, not the absence of conflict, not a place where no one struggles, but a place where people no longer feel that they must constantly prove their worth to belong. And honestly, that kind of environment can be life changing because many people have spent years carrying the pressure to appear okay, to stay composed, to manage perception, to avoid letting people see too much. And over time, that becomes exhausting, not just spiritually, but emotionally and relationally, because pretending always creates distance, even when people are physically close. And that's why grace matters so deeply in community. Grace creates room for people to still be growing, still learning, still healing, still imperfect, without fear. That weakness automatically removes belonging. And that doesn't mean everything becomes casual or careless. Grace centered relationships still require honesty, they still require accountability, and they still require truth. But truth begins to function differently when it exists inside an environment of grace. It no longer feels like a constant evaluation, it becomes part of care, part of growth, part of helping each other become healthier people. And it changes the emotional atmosphere of relationships because now people aren't gathering together trying to impress each other. They're learning how to carry each other. And honestly, that kind of community stands out today because so much of modern life encourages comparison, competition, presentation, image management. People feel pressure to curate themselves constantly, online, socially, even spiritually. And after a while, it becomes difficult to know where authenticity still exists. But a grace centered community pushes back against that. It reminds people that their value is not based on their performance, that they do not have to earn the right to be seen, that weakness does not automatically make them unwanted. And when people begin to experience that consistently, something changes. Trust begins to grow. People become more honest, more patient, more compassionate, not because everyone suddenly becomes perfect, but because grace creates room for people to be human. And honestly, that may be one of the most powerful things that the church can offer today. Not performance, not image, but grace shaped belonging. A place where people can tell the truth about where they are and still know that they are loved. And that kind of environment doesn't just happen accidentally. It's built one conversation at a time, one act of patience at a time, one moment of honesty at a time, one decision to respond with grace instead of judgment. And over time, those small moments begin shaping an entirely different kind of community, one where people feel safer, more known, more connected, more able to actually grow. Because growth happens differently when fear is not the primary motivator. And maybe that's part of what grace does best. It creates environments where transformation can happen honestly instead of performatively. So here's a simple challenge for this week. Think about the relationships and environments that you're part of, your friendships, your family, your church, your conversations, and ask yourself honestly, do people feel pressure to perform around me, or do they feel safe to be honest? Do my relationships create, or do they create space for grace? And maybe start small, maybe listen more patiently, respond less defensively, and create room for honesty. Encourage someone who feels unseen, because grace centered community is not built through big dramatic moments. It's usually built quietly through consistency, compassion, humility. And over time, those small acts of grace become the kind of environment people rarely forget. And in the next episode, we're going to continue this conversation because once grace begins shaping community, it also starts reshaping how we understand purpose, calling, and the way we live in the world. So next week, we'll talk about what it looks like to live with purpose without falling back into performance. Thanks for walking with me on Plainclothes Faith. No hype, no shortcuts, just faithful steps one day at a time.